Welcome to the Futurebuild Podcast, where we spotlight the drivers of positive impact in the built environment. I'm your host, Martin Hurn, Futurebuild Event Director, and today we have the pleasure of hosting Martin Townsend, Growth Director for BSI. With a distinguished career spanning several decades, Martin has been at the forefront of sustainability in the built environment. His work at BSI focuses on the developing standards that foster sustainable practices and innovations in construction. In this episode, we delve into Martin's career, his journey, his passion for sustainability, the role of innovation and standards in the built environment, and the importance of collaboration to achieve a sustainable future. Martin, an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you. Great to be here as well.
We've got a lot to talk about.
We have, yes.
I wanted to start off with, sort of, for anyone who doesn't know who you are and the sort of very varied career that you've had, actually, can you talk us through sort of some of your highlights and how you got into the built environment?
Yeah.
And in particular around sustainability as well, because it's always been a passion.
Of course, yeah. It's interesting, it's moments like these you kind of reflect quite a lot in terms of what your career has meant to me and what I've done for the industry, I suppose. I suppose nowadays we call it a squiggly career. It's not kind of linear, it really has moved around. And it's extended from sort of, early mornings on construction sites, knee deep in mud, trying to work out how you deliver the needs of the day based on the weather conditions, through to working for the Environment Agency, a lot of time in terms of the regulator, managing water resources across the southeast of England, my time in DEFRA in terms of policy, so working with ministers around policy on construction, my time at BRE in terms of really growing the offer there and making it truly international and turning BREEAM into an international certification, and to my time now in terms of BSI, in terms of thinking about that broader kind of role of standards play in terms of shaping the industry, and I suppose the knowledge transfer between what construction can do and what other industries are doing and vice versa. So it is squiggly and broad. I think that's the best description I can give it, but it's been enjoyable. I mean, it's a great career in terms of the people that I've met, people like yourself, in terms of the inspiration you give every time you put on your events, the people who are the change agents who really want to make things happen, the frustration they create sometimes within the industry and within themselves, and the young minds, who are really wanting to make change happen. Yeah. That as a kind of ecosystem within the industry is a great thing to be part of, I suppose.
And there's been a couple of streams that have been consistent, I think, for your career, which is sustainability and innovation, and especially at your time at BRE around things like the Innovation Park, and you mentioned BREEAM as well, the awards there.
Yeah.
What's been some of those highlights?
There are so many highlights, and I was confessed when I was on the train to get here, I was reflecting on what the highlights are. So I think some of the work we did at BRE in terms of the Innovation Park to actually make things real, and I think it's very easy sometimes when you go to conferences, things are abstract. And what the Innovation Park was trying to do was really make it come home to people to say, look, this is the art of the possible. And then meeting some of the architects, meeting some of the developers in terms of their ideas, and actually putting people into those buildings sometimes and actually seeing what the relationship between the good idea of that building and the practicalities, and actually working through some of those, and actually talking to some of the architects. I remember used to have some great conversations in the canteen with people like Bill Dunster, who used to get really frustrated to say, look, we've built beds there, why don't people get it? And then his sort of latest ideas in terms of how it could evolve, and the relationship between materials in the buildings and what that means to people's health. Some of those concepts, are so important, but it was nice to be part of it. And then also to kind of see how we evolved BREEAM in terms of making it come alive in an international, but doing it in a way which was different to make sure that it didn't reward people for what they should be doing in terms of local regulations as you took it into different countries. So you were always pushing them to innovate, not just rewarding them for what they should be doing. So those things kind of really did make a difference, I think, and they still do make a difference. I look at social media feeds sometimes and kind of look at some of the buildings which have resulted in different parts of the world, and you can see how different technologies and different skills are actually coming alive in different sort of ways in different different parts of the world.
I think the innovation park was a great inspiration to many, and I think thinking back now, you built the Code Level 6 house there. We had, you mentioned Bill Dunster, he did Zero Bill's home.
Yeah.
You had obviously King Charles, Prince Charles at that point built his natural home.
Yes.
It showed really what was possible there and then, and I think from my perspective it also shows how slow we are as an industry to move, because those homes were built 10, 15 years ago.
Exactly so. And I think, and this is one of the things I was reflecting on the train, we're really good at kind of being challenged and accepting the line of least resistance. So I think the Housing Standards Review was one of those moments for me where I got called into the select committee to defend why we needed things like the code to drive change. Because, it gave the industry certainty, it gave them structure. At that time, developers would say, I want a Code Level 6 home, and that language would almost specify what was required. And we lose that nowadays in terms of that relationship between regulation and future needs. That pathway in terms of supply chain, in terms of training, in terms of education, I think is lacking sometimes. And it's about that ambition, isn't it? Coming back to your point, we do need to be more ambitious in terms of the design of our buildings, commercial, domestic buildings, and actually understanding what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it becomes so important. This sort of measurement of impact and value, I think, is essential, and we seem to be missing that sometimes.
I think there's a recent step change though around building now, especially with quality homes.
Yeah.
We're looking at quality. Yeah. But also you mentioned future proofing as well.
Yeah.
I do agree with you. I think there's been a tendency to build to current regs rather than what's coming in. Maybe that's held back innovation.
But I think it's this sort of lesson I've learned in life, which is it's okay to experiment. And I think, back to your point about the innovation part, they were experiments. Some of them did get taken to market in different forms, but it was this opportunity, this safe space to experiment. And I think the industry sometimes plays it safe. Where do we experiment with new ideas and new concepts? Where do we really kind of challenge ourselves in terms of the art of the possible? And I think some developers are very good at doing that, but I think the market in general terms is a bit risk averse. And if we look to the future in terms of all the issues that we know we're facing in terms of climate change, in terms of price and other drivers, how do we make sure that we are responding to those in a way that we know we can actually develop the market much more successfully? And I think that process of experimenting still needs to be kind of brought to the surface much more.
And in your current role, obviously as growth director at BSI, what role do you have?
Opportunity to experiment.
Absolutely, but also set the standards as well.
Yes.
What role do you see those standards playing in driving innovation forward?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think standards are misunderstood by lots of people. They are incredibly clever vehicles in terms of sharing knowledge. So guide standards in terms of just sharing knowledge within sectors, across sectors, become incredibly important. So things like sort of circularity in terms of what does that mean? How do we design things to allow them to be more circular? So guide standards become important. The role of specification standards where you can attach them to audit. So you bring confidence to people in terms of things like greenhouse gas emissions. How do we really make sure that we're kind of bringing confidence to the market that phrases which I'm sure other speakers have talked about in terms of greenwashing, in terms of greenhushing. How do we really make sure that the industry knows that developer or that product or that service is actually, has been validated, has been audited, has got assurance behind it. And then sort of the opportunity to bring the industry together is so powerful. I've sat in committee meetings sometimes, and just been astounded that the people around the table wanting to collaborate, wanting to actually bring consistency and new knowledge to the table to drive change. So that can be things like sort of driverless vehicles, it can be around looking beyond our current narrative of net zero, looking about regenerative behaviour in terms of buildings. What does that really look like? what does that, how do we measure that? How do we kind of drive change? And I think one of the things that attracted me to BSI, I suppose, is standards can actually happen quicker than regulations. And actually we can evolve them quicker, we can pull in new knowledge. And I think if we start to think about the evolution of the standards we see today and start to make them smart, and we start to make them more digital, and we connect the data from an audit process to the standard itself, and as the knowledge from the industry comes in, the standard evolves. It's a powerful time. And actually some of the ones we're doing at the moment, you just sit back and go, I never would have thought in my professional career we would be talking about driverless vehicles.
No.
And what does that really mean though? Because when you start to look at some of the developments that are taking place, you're starting to see some developers going, okay, at the moment we're designing this development, with a very close association with the car. But actually, in the life of these buildings, that may not be the case. Do we actually need to design some of the roads and some of the spaces between buildings so that we can get rid of some of the roads, turn them into greenways, turn them into green spaces? Because by the time actually these houses have got to sort of, the midpoint of their life, maybe actually it will be driverless vehicles. You put your smart watch in the air and a car arrives, you don't need one park on your forecourt. That changes the whole mindset in terms of where the built environment is and its association with lots of changes going on.
It's a tough one, isn't it? Because how do we balance this futurist view with, as we've said, a slow-moving industry that builds to current standards?
Yes.
Or current regulations.
Yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it? And it comes back to that point, doesn't it? We do need to make sure that we are thinking about the future, even if we are just building to current regulations and current needs. We've got to think about what that future looks like so that we build it in. And it comes back to a point, I suppose, I think you and I have talked about this before, which is we need to make sure that we really empower our professionals to be the best they can. How do you really use all your experience and your qualification of your team and your own knowledge to make sure as you design a building, you're thinking about things in terms of how it might be used. Some good examples if we start to look at the way buildings are adapting or changing in terms of their need, post-pandemic, where, we had a heavy reliance on people coming to a workspace. Now you start to see kind of, spaces being used very differently. But actually sometimes some of the buildings we've designed are not that adaptable. So how do we make sure we build in adaptability, because we're not too sure what the future might hold. It might be an office building, it might be, a vertical farm in an urban area in the future, it could be anything. How do you design that thinking in a way that allows that space to actually be used for multiple purposes over its life?
Absolutely. You talked about regenerative architecture, but also we're talking about now buildings becoming material banks as well.
Exactly.
So it's not just reuse, but actually dismantle them.
Yeah. And I think this is where, you have to join conversations together, don't you? So the issue around circularity, I don't think many people really have got their minds around what circularity truly means. And when you do start to unpack it, you do start to understand it, and you're designing a product, it might be a building, it might be an individual component, with circularity in mind, you will make some very different decisions in terms of the materials, the way you're constructing it, so that you can actually reuse that space, you can start to reuse the material. It becomes really exciting. And when you look around the world, amazing practices which are way ahead of the UK, which we do need to embrace.
What I think is quite interesting at the moment is we're at a time where you've got the social value and the ethics today around that, and the right thing to do. But also now we've got the economics now starting to make an Andy Goddard on this week, who's a Will Dixon, was talking about the use of recycled materials or reusing, and that's very much from an economic point of view.
Yes.
Where on the architectural side of things, we're looking at it from an ethical point of view, and I think they're getting a lot closer. Because before they were distant, wasn't it? Exactly. We always used to say sustainability costs.
Yes.
Yes, we can build to that, but it's going to cost you more, and I don't think that's the case anymore.
No. I was trying to remember, actually, you might have to help me on this one, when we first met. I remember going to a eco-build, as it was said, Earl's Court. That shows, that's a while ago. And I look at what we were talking about then and what we're about now. And I think the exciting thing is exactly your point. We're going to see more change in the next 10 and 20 years than we've seen in the last 10 and 20 years. I do feel that lots of the debates are maturing so much quicker, and the use of technology and the consciousness of sort of the use of materials, the relationship between people and the built environment is so much more associated. People appreciate that if we don't get good design in terms of air quality or use of materials, etc., it does affect us as individuals. And I think that kind of maturing of all these conversations around the economics, around social well-being, and is going to mean some massive drivers for the future for the built environment.
But we also have our challenges because we've obviously got change of government.
Yep.
We have a big aspiration to build.
Yep.
But at the same time, we've got a perception problem within the built environment.
Yep.
But as you said there, it's actually really exciting if we start talking about AI
Yep.
and futurist theories, and it's a much more appealing, career
Yes.
for people as well. So we've got sort of balance.
Yeah, we could get into politics if we wanted to. I did have a bit of a push at the new government the other day that what we've really got to start to think about is this relationship between standards and regulation, and also how do we ensure that the people with the experience, lots of people that you are interviewing, how do they become part of the process of really driving change in the more formal sense? So then I kind of pitched there was, if you look at policy making, regulation making, it takes a long time. A good example to quote is sort of the online safety bill. David Cameron talked about it in the House of Commons. 10 years later, it came to be. That's a long time for something that makes a lot of sense. So can you start to re-engineer some of the policy making of government by bringing experts around the select committee tables to get their support to write the green papers, the white papers, to drive change from a policy perspective quicker? Because we can't wait sometimes for regulation that takes 10 years. So there has to be some rethinking in terms of how do you use the wit and wisdom of the industry along with the political weight to drive change quicker. And I think there are mechanisms. If you can bring those together through select committees and the writing of the various sort of papers to get consensus, I think we could really make a difference.
Yeah.
Great opportunity.
The industry for a long time has talked about the amount of grants held back innovation in particular. Although we saw great times of innovation when things like zero carbon homes was in place, and actually it was the removal of that slowed down innovation. So, what do you see? What's going to drive innovation in the future?
It's I think that's what I mentioned a few moments ago. I've done a lot of work recently with sort of incubator hubs for innovators, and the bit that I love about it is this kind of childlike ambition, if I can describe it. That sounds a bit demeaning, it doesn't mean to be, which is when you talk to innovators, they really feel they can change the world. And then you kind of start to kind of wake them up to all sorts of the rules they need to meet, etc., and you can see them describe the weight of that weighs heavy on their shoulders. What we need to do is lift some of that to allow innovation to really come alive. And one of the interesting conversations I had at Imperial a couple of weeks back was how do we make sure that we can make innovation come alive quicker? How do we make sure that we can almost specify it? So if you look at London, could you specify in the London plan a level of innovation for large developments that allows people to kind of experiment about the art of the possible? How do you make sure that we can get large developers to embrace some innovation, accepting that it's an experiment and accept that some of it might fail, some of it might pass, but actually not worry about that, actually embrace that, but also embrace the opportunity of what it might mean if we start to look at things like sort of low carbon concrete, or we start to look at circular design within buildings, or we start to look at, circadian lighting in buildings, how does that change and what does that mean for us and what does it do in terms of productivity? The list is endless, but it is about not finding reasons why we can't do it. It's about embracing it and finding reasons how we can do it. And I think that becomes a really exciting space when you start to kind of change your mindset, going back to that kind of that young child that thinks everything's possible. We've got to kind of keep within our innovators and actually support them and actually use some of our existing mechanisms to make it come alive and create that capacity. Because when it does work, it's transformative. You know, and you and I must know hundreds of examples of innovation that basically, you know, we often forget about, but actually now just mass market. You know, it all started somewhere. It all needed somebody to take a risk. It all needed somebody to adopt it to go, this really works well for me.
And I think I've spent a lot of time talking to startup brands. You know, things like the Earthshot Prize now.
Yes.
Are great PR and marketing vehicles for them. And I always say they've got a real advantage now, almost over the perceived slower moving corporate brands. You know, that actually I think there's this view that people want to support innovation. You want to see it succeed, and it's just getting out there.
It is, and it is that bringing together of the conversation, I suppose, between the big corporates, the startups, and getting them in a room together and going, right, so how do we work together? How do we really make this conversation come alive? And I find it really fascinating from a standards perspective where some of our standards don't actually always support them because they are at the cutting edge of the technology. And therefore we need to make sure that our standards allow that scope and that flexibility while still making sure things are safe and, you know, and it's not impacting on people's health or on sort of any other risks in terms of the building which that technology is being put in, but it's all possible.
I was going to ask you about that because that is a common theme that comes up where, you know, innovators, they struggle with the testing costs or BBA certification or going through BRE, and it becomes cost prohibitive. But as an industry, we have to have, you know, Grenfell was a very prime example of the need for, you know, materials that meet a code and are safe, you know, into our buildings. And so, you know, it's a real challenge, I think, for startups to navigate that.
It is. We're doing a little bit of some interesting work at the moment, and this is triggered to some extent by the work we've done with these innovation kind of hubs. Can we actually use AI to help innovators understand what the rules are, what the regulations are, what the needs are that they might need to face? Because one of the conversations that's quite common that I've sort of had when I've spoken to innovators go, I don't even know where to start. I don't even know what number standard I even need to read, let alone download, and you know, and there's a cost associated with it, and I don't even know what I need to test to. You know, it's just this fog that wraps around me, and people will quote numbers at me. If you work in the standards industry, we all quote lots of standards on a regular basis. So we're kind of running this little bit of a pilot moment, and we've got an AI engine that we've put on our standards database, so you can ask it questions. You know, I am this particular product, I'm trying to access this market. How and what standards are relevant to me? And straight away it will start to pull out clauses, it will start to kind of explain the art of the possible. And that becomes really powerful because you're then starting to help people navigate what can be a confusing space and allow them to learn to evolve. And then we can support them and say, oh, maybe we can help you here, or maybe we can sort of, you know, do something slightly different because the product you'll bring to market doesn't conform here, doesn't conform there. And so some of these sort of more bespoke approaches, I think, will help innovators, because I think we do need to evolve there.
Which parts of the industry do you think we need to see more innovation and more change? I suppose that ties in with what's our biggest challenges.
God, you are on the big questions. There are so many opportunities, I think. You know, when I look at kind of scope 3 and supply chains, I kind of think there's a whole load of challenges there. And I think sort of we do need to use blockchain and AI more to kind of unravel that. It does become really fascinating in terms of how the industry really needs to understand the impact, not just from a kind of emissions perspective, but things like modern day slavery and supply chains as well. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done around supply chains and making them more transparent. We did a bit of work a while ago when we launched our modern day slavery standard, and we did a survey on the back of it, and most corporates basically turned around and I've got no idea if there's modern day slavery or supply chain. Absolutely no idea at all. And then you go, how come? And then you go, well, we've got 30,000 suppliers, you know, whatever the number is, but it's big numbers. You know, we do audit, but I can't put my hand on my heart and say that. I don't know if there's somebody in a supply chain somewhere in the world that basically is in slavery. So there's a whole issue there. There's a whole issue around this scope 3. I think we need to kind of start to think about scope 4 in terms of how we design our systems, our processes to kind of like think about kind of avoided emissions. It picks up the point we talked about as well. I think sometimes we're lying to ourselves where we go, oh, net zero 2050. Actually, that's not the end of the story. We need to think about regenerative behaviour. How do we make sure that we're capturing carbon? How do we think about circularity? How do we really think about the true life of a building, its impact? And how do we start to think about that regeneration, which we need to kind of think about when it comes to the impact the built environment has had for such a long time? There's lots of challenges there. I could go on, the list is kind of endless, isn't it really? But the thing I'm most hopeful about is there are some great innovators. There are amazing designers out there that are really challenging the boundaries. And I've been very fortunate being in meetings with clients and engineers and architects, where the client's got their vision of what they want, and the architect is, you can see them kind of pushing, moving the boundaries a little bit, just to make sure that those buildings that we point to on a regular basis through various awards have really kind of challenged the art of the possible. And then sort of, you know, some of that then just becomes the natural dialogue for future clients. Well, we've done this over here, can we do this for you as well?
We had Duncan Baker-Brown on the first episode, and we talked about actually the changing role of an architect, and actually that they're much more like consultants. Well, they always have a consultant, but much more of a sustainability consultancy. Yeah. And really holding that client's hand and talking through intrinsics of a more sustainable built environment. It's a fascinating place. I've got a question I normally do at the end, but actually you mentioned it now, and it's all around those individuals that are making a big positive impact on the built environment. You mentioned you sort of engage with a lot of people there. Who stands out from you? And I suppose also going back further, you mentioned Bill Dunster, you're a ton of PRE, and you've worked with people like Paul King, GBC, even Peter Bonfield, your time there. You sort of met many inspirational people that create a positive impact.
Definitely is. I think I've been very, very fortunate because I have met lots of people who really understand the industry, understand the barriers, your question about some of the barriers that we're facing, but actually have been very creative in terms of knowing where to push the industry, knowing how to kind of demonstrate to the industry the art of the possible. And some of those, interestingly, seem to be kind of disruptors, some of those are seen to be real kind of sort of thought leaders. And we need all of those. We need those that basically, get on and do the job and then make sort of marginal progress in some areas. We need the people that just basically throw everything up in the air and just wants to do something completely different. But the list is endless. And I think sometimes it's the people you don't expect who sometimes have the biggest influence. Because I suppose when you work with some big names, some of the big architectural companies, some of the individuals that have their own brand, you do have an expectation to want to be wowed and to be inspired by them. But sometimes it's the names that you don't know that sometimes kind of go, okay, I never thought about that. I always remember going to an eco-build and talking to an architect from India, and he had just put up his first certified building in India, and he was doing a lecture on it, and everybody assumed, because it was fresh, that the building he was talking about was actually this latest certified building, and he was talking about using sort of natural materials, external shading. He was talking about cross ventilation, sort of some of the concepts we still talk about today in terms of design. He was talking about a Hindu temple that was a couple hundred years old.
Oh, wow.
And it kind of, those moments you go, we think we're being clever, and we think this is the latest thinking, actually, it's not.
Yeah.
And some of those moments just remind you that actually we've got a lot to learn from our past practice, and actually the natural design and the good design of buildings is sometimes forgotten. So some of the kind of like the computer programs and some of the pressures that our teams are under means that we're kind of sort of doing the shortcuts.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, if you get good design right, actually it can be just quite natural. Putting trees next to a building to create some external shading in certain countries, it's not a bad thing. Yeah, nowadays we want to put kind of louvers on certain faces of buildings to kind of provide that cross ventilation's been around for centuries. Locally sourcing materials, that was what you did centuries ago, because that's all you had. You had a cart, you had to kind of, provide the supply of materials locally. So we kind of, some of those conversations, some of those inspiring conversations, and going back to what we talked about before, some of the innovators, I think as you get older, you have to be really careful that you don't believe that your experience is what will guide the conversation. You have to start every conversation with an open mind and going, there are people out there that have got great new ideas. I need to embrace those. I need to listen to them. And if I can help and support them with experience and to help navigate some of the pitfalls they might fall into, that's a great kind of relationship to have.
Yeah.
But yeah, love everybody I worked with. There's so many good conversations that I remember, which have basically had a massive impact. But you almost remember that meeting. I remember many meetings sitting at BRE when we were talking about sort of some of the credit structures, or evolving from new construction in use to refurbishments to communities. You sit there and you kind of like thinking, those are those moments where you've had that ripple effect, and as a result of that, you then sort of listen to some of the projects that result in different countries. You're going, do you know what? That all comes back to that moment in time.
And I think some of those people we mentioned are still fighting now for that change, and I think that's what, especially Bill.
He will never give in.
He will never give in. But maybe an easier question then is who are some of the emerging future leaders that you're seeing coming through?
That's a real challenging question, isn't it? I think there's lots of them around. I do worry though, because I've seen a few come into the industry have actually been quite hit hard by the industry and the sort of the need to conform and the need to deliver solutions quickly. But actually, it takes a certain tenacity. I think we're wrong to name names, but I've seen so many great people, particularly through the innovation work, come in. And when you actually also go to some of these awards as well, and you listen to the stories of the challenges they're facing, it's about just being resilient. And I think one of the lessons I've learned, certainly in my career, is personal resilience is incredibly important. And going back to your earlier question about these influences and these mentors that you connect with, you need them around you, because there will be moments in your career where you just go, hard work.
Yeah.
And you need to have that ability to kind of pull on your network to kind of make sure you lift yourself up as well as lift other people. So yeah, I think mentors and influencers and the networks you create are incredibly important.
And I think that's a real positive of the built environment. I know you're on a lot of advisory boards and steering groups and different initiatives, but I think that's a really important part of the built environment.
It is.
And that really brings us together. We talk about collaboration quite a lot.
I think, and I've learned this in the various sort of initiatives I've worked in, the industry feels big. When you talk about the size of the construction industry, the influence of the industry, but But when you actually start to break it down and you start to look at some of the themes within the industry, it's actually incredibly small. You and I together with a notepad for half an hour could probably list out the key influences that are making a difference, the key people who you really do need to have, connections to, because it feels like a big industry, but it's not. And I wrestle with that's a good thing or a bad thing, because if we rely too much on a small group of people, does that actually push people out? I'm not too sure. We do need to make sure that we are an industry that inspires people to join us. So, when people are selecting their future educational kind of qualifications, they look at the industry and go, that's an industry I want to be associated with. That's going to give me opportunities to kind of really do something different. There's opportunities in terms of evolving the industry, changing the industry. Because the thing about the built environment is it touches us every single day in terms of where we live, how we travel, where we work, our access to green space. The built environment has a massive influence on us. And if we don't encourage the right people to come into the industry, I think we're letting ourselves down. So we've got to change our attitude. We've got to change our culture sometimes to make sure we are the go-to industry to inspire people to join. There are lots of opportunities when you go to universities, and we just need to make sure the built environment is the no-brainer industry. We go, that's where I want to go, because it's an opportunity for me to make a real difference.
And I think let's talk about the impact that the construction industry has. It has some negative impacts. It accounts for 50% of all CO2 emissions. It's almost 50% of all waste that goes to landfill.
Yeah.
But also, that's the biggest opportunity to make a positive difference.
It is. And it's interesting. I'm doing some work at the moment with Oxford University and Cambridge University, because I think it's the evolution of sustainability in my head anyway, which is, we've seen environmental sustainability. We've introduced the social components to that as well. We really understand the relationship between the built environment and sort of how it affects us, sort of health and well-being element. And the evolution of that now is very much around what is a purpose-driven organisation. And as we start to think about the built environment, can I really truly measure what the true impact of that development is? And there are endless examples that you might build a building, but how do you then integrate into that community? How do we make sure that we create that sense of value in that community for the building I've created? How do we start to look at the health and well-being of the people within the building? What is the true impact of development? And actually, we need to start to measure that much more effectively so that we can start to understand what we're doing, but also, investors, developers start to go, there's more that I can do to kind of influence, and there's more that I can do to kind of demonstrate what I am actually doing beyond just the simple concrete or the bricks.
It's really hard to explain. I don't know if you remember, many years ago we met with the Mayor of Bristol together, and they were doing the housing festival there. And
yes.
He was a great advocate of that community-led regeneration. Creating those dark communities. But it seems like in the UK it happens in pockets. It has to take an inspirational leader or someone that wants a big difference to do it. It's not a mainstream thing.
Exactly. And I think that's where we need that greater transparency around what is the impact of the built environment. And your point, what is the positive and the negative impacts of the built environment, so that we can think about it in a much more proactive way. I think sometimes we get very fixated on some of the metrics, on carbon emissions, whereas actually, it's a massive impact in terms of how the built environment affects our life, and it's about the scale of intervention in terms of it might be a single development, it might be multiple developments. How do we really understand that better so that we can actually learn from it and drive it? How do corporates truly become purpose-driven? When you start to look at some organisations that are starting to really understand what a purpose-driven organisation, it's quite inspiring. There's some work we've done recently with Anglian Water where they have really started to understand that the role they play is about the provision of water. But actually, when they build their new resources, they can think about the recreational value, they can think about the conservation value, they can think about the whole social value of what they're trying to do beyond than just simply providing water into supply. And if you start to kind of measure that and you start to design that thinking into your processes, it does become really powerful. It's a much more high level strategic environmental assessment, I suppose. How am I actually really driving change in a way that is better than just the economics of kind of providing resources? You think about that at a community scale, great opportunity for engineers, architects to really push the boundaries.
I think water is going to be one of the biggest challenges of the future, not only how we capture it, how we use it, or reduce the use of it, how we deal with the loss of it as well.
Yes.
It's probably our biggest challenge. Water scarcity in the summer months and a lot in the winter.
I do think sometimes that we have become very fixated on some of the thematics like carbon and actually are missing some of the other areas like water, like waste. And I'm with you on this one. I've been in a lot of work recently with water companies in terms of trying to truly understand how we can manage water more successfully. So how do we start to think about kind of the resilience of properties in the floodplain? What does that look like from a self-help perspective in terms of products that are designed to sort of protect a single property from flooding? How do you design those in? How do you retrofit those in? How do you bring confidence and how do you bring incentives like insurance in terms of that market? And then you've got the other flip side about sort of water scarcity. There's some horrendous statistics when you do it globally. I think by 2050, if we use the same carbon date, 80% of the world's population will be in a water scarce area. Those numbers are mind-blowing, and yet we take water for granted. It is, particularly in the UK, you turn the tap on, you expect water to come freely from it. Yet the processes behind it, the management of water quality, the management of water resources is incredibly fragile. And there is so much more that we can do. So you go back to our conversation about the code. We had standards in terms of increasing the use of sort of water and bills, making lower values in terms of per consumption capita in buildings. We're not driving that as much as we can do. When you look across Europe, we're not leading the way in terms of water efficiency in buildings. We've got some big issues in terms of customer side leakage, where there used to be lots of leakage in terms of the water company side of the meter. That's now flipping in terms of leakage within homes. So there's a lot of things we can do. I remember when I worked for an environment agency, when I was responsible for water resources, almost in the first week, we had one of the biggest droughts possible. And I remember sitting down with the water companies at the time going, look, this is not going to, based on our predictions, this is not going to be good. We are going to have lots of hosepipe bans. But we might have different messages because we're different organisations, but let's make it really clear to the consumer the role that they play. And we came up with some simple messages about turning your tap off when you brush your teeth, filling your washing machine, etc. And we saw consumption drop because every single person in the UK knew that they could play a role, and the impact their sort of inefficient use of resource was having in terms of the environment. But what was the fascinating bit is when went from a drought to a flood, consumption didn't go back up because they had retrained their behaviour. They turned their tap off when they brush their teeth and they never turned it back on again. And it just shows how elastic behaviour can be when we educate people about why things are important.
And the impact of behavioural change.
Exactly so.
We saw it with the rising energy costs, and everyone started to switch their lights off, which we should have been doing for many years. It's really interesting you talk about the sort of too much focus on carbon, because I sort of agree. You mentioned there water scarcity and challenges around water, but also we're in a biodiversity emergency at the moment, which is a huge issue for the environment, especially with now biodiversity net gain becoming an important part of the planet.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's such an important part that we forget. And when we leave our homes or we leave our offices, and we walk around and we see some of the rich, diverse environments we have, the built environment has a massive role to play in terms of contributing to it. And it doesn't take a lot in terms of making sure that before development you're understanding the ecological value you have, understanding the impact of your development and how you can design in good features. That is, in my mind, something which is fundamental in the role that all developers and architects can play. Because we are relying on our environment in terms of our health, our well-being, our food supply. There's lots of things that we sometimes forget about. And if we all lived in London, sometimes when you don't always have access to that space, you're living in a flat with no access immediately to a good environment. You forget how important it is.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of good design, access to green space, the biodiversity benefits, some of the rules and legislations that are coming out which will drive that even more, I think is so important. And we need to really do the most we can. We all have a role to play in that.
I agree, urban greening is so important.
It is. It comes back to the point we were talking about when we talk about things like future drivers. If you start to look at what we might see in the urban environment in terms of driverless vehicles, there's a number, I think this is validated, which is 40% of London is related to the car. So if you start to kind of reimagine what that will look like, do you actually create more housing? Or do you actually, if you're kind of freeing up some of the roads, do you turn them into green arteries to allow people to cycle? Do you kind of create new walkways for people to move around urban spaces? Because if we're going to have less vehicles on our roads, how do we actually reimagine what that space will be used for? It's a great opportunity to kind of be creative, I suppose, from a local authority perspective.
And these ideas aren't theory anymore because it's happening across Europe.
Yeah.
And they're seeing the results.
Exactly. This is where we've got to look at things in the round. Maybe it's because I've got to that point in my career where I'm kind of becoming more strategic in my thinking. I've done the detailed policy work. We do have to kind of take a bigger picture and say there are multiple wins here. But how do we create value through development? I always remember when I worked for the Environment Agency, one of my roles, we used to do a lot of work with developers around new development next to rivers. And at the time, they used to quite often want to culvert the river and build as close to it as possible. And I had a boss at the time whose argument was, no, you should turn the development onto the river and you should open up the river. You should make it the feature for the development, not the bit that sits at the back of people's gardens. And I remember there endless arguments with developers about, no, I want to culvert it because that's valuable land to me. You go, well, you can't do that because we're going to need it for maintenance anyway. So why don't you just make it a feature? Why don't you turn it into something which is, and the developers that did do it, I think if I bumped into them today, go, do you know what, you've increased the value of my development because you've created something which really brings that community alive, that provides real ecological value. And we were looking at it purely from a sort of, maximising the land, not also always thinking about what makes this the best possible development.
Yeah.
So it's some of those things where you do have to kind of stay true to your beliefs and actually push the conversation.
We saw it with Olympic Park, particularly at Hackney Wick.
Yeah.
There are development areas around there making the river an absolute focus. No, you're absolutely right. I'm going to ask you for some names now. But it's more around we talked a lot around material innovation.
Yeah.
And you're saying there's a lot of stuff that excites you that's sort of coming through the pipeline. Or what are some of those?
When I look at innovation, I think AI is going to have a massive impact on the industry. I was at a lecture last night with the BBC, and it was a lecture on AI, and it was very much focused on healthcare. So there was a lot of use of AI within healthcare. But I sat there and I listened, and I was thinking, we've really only scratched the surface when it comes to AI in the construction industry. In terms of optimizing the processes, in terms of how we build, when we bring materials onto site. I know some companies are using AI to think about the logistics and how we organise sites more effectively. even at using AI in terms of crane movements, how do we optimise that? And I know quite a lot of developers are using that much, much more. I think AI will have a massive impact on the industry. I think going back to what we talked about before in terms of things like blockchain, I think circularity will have a massive impact. If it doesn't, I'm going to be really disappointed. Because, you know, when I look across the world, you know, there are many countries that are way ahead of us around circularity in terms of design, from all levels, from the individual component all the way up to, you know, the buildings and communities and how you design with circularity in mind. I think we need to open our mind in terms of what does that mean in terms of new models. Yeah. So I do think we're kind of, I'm a big fan of people who talk about how we've gone through different evolutions in terms of commodities, products, services. I think we need to think about the built environment much more as an experience economy. And what does that really mean when we start to design our communities and design our cities? How do we make sure that we're thinking about the experience economy in mind? What does that look like in terms of how we use different spaces? Before we start, we talk about the high street, you know, how do we really reimagine how we bring people in and how do we use technology and experience economy to make these spaces much more vibrant? There's some great examples where what does the experience economy look like within a residential space? You know, why should every flat have a kitchen? Why don't you have communal kitchens so you're forced out of your space into a communal area where you are cooking together, you're mixing together, because that vertical kind of space is a community. And does that mean that you finish work, you sit at home, you lock the door, and you basically, you know, do whatever you do? Why don't you reimagine that and actually think about the experience of living with people means that, you know, who within that community shares your same interests, you know, where the group of people want to go cycling, where the group of people want to watch a film on a Thursday. How do you reimagine the built environment to become completely different in terms of the opportunities?
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because I think as a British sort of culturally, we you know, your home is your castle, you know, type thing, and you know, we're obsessed with buying. Yeah. But actually, you mentioned the circular economy. I think one of the biggest ways that's going to accelerate through the lease economy. Yeah. And actually to move away from ownership. Yes. That's really, you know, how that can really accelerate.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because I think it was Wicks or Weber did a really interesting study quite a few years back now, where they were looking at what are our different needs in our life. So when we leave university, it's probably kind of like relatively simple space, close to a pub, probably not far from some kind of transport hub. That's the kind of the basic needs when I go to university. That's what I need in terms of accommodation. And as you mature, your needs change. And actually being in a leasing economy allows you to move around, allows you to flex. You might change your needs as you become sort of, you know, more mature in your years. Your kind of green credentials might become so much more important. So you'll be making decisions about the place you live and how it's built and how you use it. That allowing that movement, but also your space needs change as well. Yeah. So how do you kind of like really create opportunities in the market to allow people to expand as they have a family and contract as they sort of, you know, move on in life? That's massive opportunities to reimagine things, but we are locked into the way we do things, and I think we do need to open our minds in terms of what are the business models that we buy into, which actually help us in our life to do what we need to do, when we need to do it. So you're right, it's massive opportunities.
New technology is fascinating. You know, you mentioned AI, blockchain, but at the same time, the industry is wanting more bio-based materials, which is almost at the complete opposite end of the technology. Although we are bringing modern thinking, modern engineering, you know, CLC technology now has elevated what we can do with SIP panels. You know, there's a move to hempcrete now as well, and hemp insulation.
I always remember we talked about the innovation park. We had a hempcrete building on the innovation park, and it's another one of those materials that is not really understood. But when you start to kind of understand it, and you understand how you can grow the material, you can capture the carbon in that material, the ease of manufacture, not just in this country, but in third world countries as well. It's incredibly powerful, but we're only starting to really now explore that. Yeah, as you said, that was 10 years ago on the Innovation Park. And people were coming down, this is great, and then you go, and what are you going to do about it?
It's taking chemicals out of our house.
I know.
Another study, I don't know if you were directly involved, but BRE did was around biophilia homes as well.
Yes.
Oliver Heath back then as well.
Yeah. No, I think it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I remember getting involved in some of the biophilic stuff, but also really making sure it worked as it should do. Because we did some trials. I remember some of the initial trials. A lot of the sort of some of the green walls that went into office buildings were all about the psychology, because the way they were designed sometimes actually it made you feel good about the environment you're in, but because some of the designs and some of the components weren't quite engineered correctly, it didn't actually change some of the indoor air quality. But through research and through tweaking some of the designs, you actually did get an improvement in some of the indoor quality. But it actually is interesting how even some of those early designs basically kind of helped people in terms of psychology. Because if you kind of look at some of the office buildings sort of 10 years ago, simple white spaces seem to be now we start to kind of bring in sort of plants into those environments. It does have an impact on our well-being.
Yeah.
And we do need to kind of really understand that. And so those examples which we talked about as well in terms of understanding our circadian rhythms and making sure the lighting levels reflect the seasons of the year, because actually our bodies are designed to be outside, yet we now spend most of our time in buildings, and actually it's therefore we need to make sure that we are being much more sensitive to how our bodies react through the seasons of the year, and getting kind of sort of the quality, getting the temperature, getting the lighting levels right to actually work with our own rhythms becomes really important.
In terms of decarbonisation, which is obviously a big thing,
Yes.
there's multiple school of thoughts at the moment. Big one is obviously electrifying our heating at the moment, our heat networks and heat pumps. I'd love to ask where you sort of stand on that, because government went down hydrogen on the heat pump side, but also sort of pulling you back into your early part of your career, which is your time at Tarmac as well, and what the concrete industry is doing. Because there is great advancements in low carbon concrete at the moment as well.
There is, and there's new standards coming out on that as well. I think if you look at levers that the industry can pull, low carbon concrete, it's a massive lever that can be pulled. Yeah, it comes back to this issue, doesn't it, in terms of all the competing demands on the construction side, because when you start to look at some of the concrete that is low carbon concrete, it might take longer to cure.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, people will say, well, okay, I can see the benefit from a carbon perspective, but I need to get this project delivered in this timescale. So we do have these competing demands in terms of making sure we're making the right long-term decisions, but also we're thinking about how that actually affects other parts of the process. But there's some innovation going back to what we talked about earlier. You're now starting to see some concrete that can actually capture carbon as well. So if we start to look at what that means over the life of a building, you're going to be capturing carbon as that concrete really sort of starts to kind of understand, we understand the impact it's having and how we can actually capture the carbon in that process. And I think that's where we've got to get really imaginative in terms of understanding all the materials we use in the building, understand the life of them. Are they short-term materials that will get replenished and replaced? Are they there for the whole life of the building? How can we service them? How can we maintain them? What's the impact on us in terms of off-gassing or other impacts in terms of relationship with people? All of that, I think, is an area that is starting to be understood much, much more. But we do need to make some brave decisions in terms of how we construct our buildings, and particularly around sort of say concrete, how we get to the right materials for the long-term sort of impact on the environment.
Yeah. Yeah. We could talk all day.
I haven't even scratched the surface.
I know we haven't. But I have the last two questions I'm going to ask you. The first one is, what's a book that's creating a real impact on your life?
That's a really good question. That was on the script.
It wasn't on there.
I think one that's really, one of those books you come back to again and again. Was The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, which is about it's a Dan Millman book. It's about how, if you want to influence change, you have two courses. You can be angry, and I think all of us in our early careers are probably kind of angry and frustrated because we want to make an impact and we want to do it quickly. And I think that book was quite instrumental in terms of making me realise that the way of making change happen is to be a peaceful warrior. So you still are a warrior, but you're doing it in a way that actually is a positive influence in terms of society. And in that, there's lots of lessons about speed. Making sure that that you've got momentum in what you want to do in life, but sometimes realising that you can't solve problems overnight, and you might have to kind of come back to a problem at some point, put it to one side, pick up something else and come back to it again, because sometimes your timing and the timing of others are not always compatible. It's a great read. There are from some sort of textbooks, some of Bill Dunster's work in terms of great. I love some of his thinking, because he goes beyond. He thinks about the individual components. He thinks about the buildings. He thinks about communities. I've got a funny story. I always remember when he invented his first electrical bike, and he kind of brought it to the innovation park, and he saw me kind of sort of coming across and come have a go. Didn't tell me in a very Bill kind of way that it went from slow to fast. There was nowhere in between. It was just like on or off. And I think I was doing about 40, 50 miles an hour on this bike within seconds. And I'm thinking, okay, this is the future of e-bikes. I think it's quite scary. You've got to bear in mind, this was like 10, 15 years ago.
We built a racetrack. Well, not a race. We ended up being a racetrack. We built a bike track at EcoBuild in 2014 or 15 to showcase those bikes. Yeah. And we put a minister on one of them, and it didn't end well. Although I saw Bill at this year's Futurebuild, and he's developed that bike even further. It is extremely scary now.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's very passionate about his electric bike.
But I think the thing it's a really good demonstration, which is he was thinking about interchangeability of power packs. How do I take it from a building into a bike, into a car? How do I make this really usable? How do I kind of think about what is the relationship between the building and the transport network? Yeah. And if you go back to Bedset, there was electric charging points when that was built. That was what, 1990. He was building that kind of concept into the design of buildings at that time. You go, that was way beyond what we were thinking at the time. So that's some great books there. What other books would I'm trying to think. Flora Samuels did a great book in terms of architecture and sustainability. Really thought-provoking work in terms of the role of the architects in terms of driving the concept. Going back to your point, which is real opportunity at the concept stage for the architect to make a difference, to understand the role of place and the role of good design and orientation. Lots of really good messages in that book. God, the list is endless. I'm a great podcast as well as kind of YouTube follower. So people like Joe Pine, who talked about the experience economy, does a great YouTube clip in terms of how we need to evolve. What does that experience economy look like? What does it look like? He's obviously doing it from a broader sense, but it's a very small journey to think about what that looks like from a built environment perspective. I love sucking in information, to be honest.
So I was going to wrap up with a question around sort of what's your piece of advice for people coming into the industry, but I think you've covered that quite a lot. So I'm going to give you a bit of a harder question, which is,
Okay.
What's your vision of the future? And what do you want to see happen, I suppose, to make the most positive impact on?
I think this time is probably one of the most exciting times for the industry. There are lots of things coming together. We touched upon that in terms of materials, in terms of design, in terms of change, in terms of business models, be it kind of leasing models or circularity models, but also it is the most fragile of times. When we start to look at kind of, a growing, aging population, we really do need to make sure that we are thinking about our buildings for all of our needs through the whole of our life. In that, we need to be more adventurous, we need to be more considerate, we need to innovate harder. That means that the industry is a great opportunity for people to kind of work in. But I am worried that if I was leaving university and I look at the construction industry, have we got that reputation, that brand, which really attracts the best talent? So I think we're in this moment in time where we have this massive opportunity to do some really clever stuff, but we also have an opportunity to kind of stay doing what we've always been doing. And I think podcasts like this are great to get people to reimagine, to rethink. But I think that the future for the built environment is one that is in our hands at the moment, and we can take it in either direction. And I think it's down to lots of the people that lots of the people you're going to be interviewing, to inspire, to drive, to support the industry to be the best it can be, because we do need leaders in the industry. And it's one of the things that when I look at other industries across the various sectors, who are the leaders in the built environment that will really stand up to support the industry to change? And with a new government in the UK, who's going to be that voice that's going to say, you really need to trust the industry, you need to support the industry to be the best it can be?
I think we've had so much change in our ministers in the housing construction.
Yeah.
It's been multiple.
Yes.
In quite a short space of time,
Yes.
and I agree with you. It's the industry that's got to stand up, and I think we see it. We've got great groups like ACAN, Architects Declare, Letty, UKGBC, that sort of stand outside of the institutions, and do drive that forward.
I think that there needs to be this, and I think UKGBC does this really well. We need to work together in a more collaborative way. I think one of the things we haven't touched upon is collaboration in the industry is key here. We need to make sure that we are really working together. We put some of our baggage, we put some of our commercial thinking to one side around some of the big issues of the day and say, what is the best industry can be? What are the barriers that collectively we need to work through to drive change? I've been in meetings sometimes where you almost need to grab them by the scruff of the neck and go, look guys, I understand why you're saying what you're saying, but we can do better than that. One of the things I have to share is I did, in the pandemic, like all of us, I did a number of online courses, and one of them, which was really amusing, was improvisation comedy.
Oh, wow.
And I did it because I just thought it'd be an interesting thing to do, but it taught me a lot about meetings. Because what was really interesting around improvisation comedy is it only really works when you build and build and build. And as you pass the comedy on to somebody else, it's about the and, not the but or the if. And I use that in meetings on a regular basis now, that, if people start using but, if, I kind of close it down really quick. Look, if you're coming to this meeting, it's all about the build and what can you do, and if we do this, it'll be even better. Because that narrative really changes conversations about the art of the possible. It's the conversation where, but, have you not thought about that? If, which closes things down. So we can learn a lot from improvisation comedy in terms of how we set our attitude for change.
We'll get you on another podcast for a comedy masterclass.
Comedy special, yes.
No, absolutely. Martin, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure.